I submitted an expense report for a client dinner that cost $847, and the VP of sales stood up in the middle of the quarterly all-hands meeting in front of 230 employees and said my name out loud, held up a printed copy of the receipt, and asked whether I thought the company was made of money or whether I simply did not understand the concept of fiduciary responsibility. The company was called Strat Industries, a manufacturing and distribution firm in Pittsburgh with about 1,200 employees and annual revenue of $340 million, and I had been working there for 4 years as a senior account manager responsible for a portfolio of enterprise clients that generated approximately $28 million in annual sales. The client dinner had been with the procurement director and CFO of one of our largest accounts, a meeting I had scheduled to discuss a contract renewal worth $4.2 million over 3 years, and the restaurant had been chosen by the client, not by me. The $847 included dinner for 3 people, 2 bottles of wine that the client had ordered, and an automatic 18% gratuity. It was expensive, but it was within the company's published expense policy for client entertainment, and I had secured a verbal commitment for the contract renewal during that dinner. But none of that mattered to Richard Paulson, the VP of sales, who had decided to use my expense report as an example of what he called wasteful spending and lack of cost discipline. Richard was in his early 50s, had been with the company for 9 years, and had a management style that combined aggressive sales tactics with public humiliation of anyone he perceived as stepping out of line. He did not pull me aside privately. He did not send me an email. He waited until the quarterly meeting, the one where the entire company gathered in the cafeteria to hear updates from leadership, and he used the open floor Q&A session to call me out by name. He said the company was tightening budgets and that everyone needed to be more mindful of expenses, and then he held up my receipt and said this was exactly the kind of excess that we could not afford. He did not mention that I had secured a $4.2 million contract renewal. He did not mention that my territory had exceeded its sales target by 17% in the previous quarter. He did not mention that the expense was policy compliant. He simply made me an example, and the room went silent, and I felt 230 pairs of eyes on me as my face burned and my hands clenched under the table. I did not respond. I did not defend myself. I sat there, nodded slightly, and waited for the meeting to end. Then I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and started building a file. The humiliation was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Over the previous 18 months, Richard had created a culture in the sales organization where public criticism was normalized, where account managers were routinely called out in meetings for minor infractions or perceived failures, and where the message was clear: your success meant nothing if Richard decided to make you a target. I had watched him do it to other people. I had seen him criticize a colleague for submitting a proposal 2 hours past a deadline, even though the proposal had won the contract. I had seen him question another account manager's judgment for offering a client a volume discount, even though the discount was standard practice and had closed a $6 million deal. And I had noticed that the people he targeted most frequently were women, people of color, and anyone who did not fit his preferred profile of aggressive, extroverted, socially dominant salespeople. I had assumed that if I kept my head down, exceeded my targets, and followed the rules, I would be safe. I was wrong. The receipt incident showed me that Richard did not care about performance or compliance. He cared about control, and he used public humiliation as a tool to maintain it. I started with the expense reports. If Richard was going to question my spending, I was going to examine his. The company's expense management system was accessible to all employees for their own reports, but managers had visibility into their team's expenses, and I did not have access to Richard's submissions. However, I did have access to historical financial data through the sales commission system, which tracked revenue, costs, and profitability by territory and by manager. I pulled the data for the past 3 years and started looking for patterns. What I found was striking. Richard's personal expenses were consistently higher than any other VP in the company. His average monthly expense report was $6,400 compared to an average of $2,800 for the other three VPs. He submitted frequent charges for high-end restaurants, luxury hotels, and first-class flights, all categorized as client entertainment or business travel. I cross-referenced his expenses against the CRM system to see which clients he had been meeting with, and I found discrepancies. Many of the expenses had no corresponding client meetings logged in the system. Some of the restaurants were in cities where we had no active accounts, and several of the hotel charges were for weekend stays that did not align with any scheduled business events. I could not access the actual receipts; those were stored in the finance department system, but I could document the patterns, and I did. I built a spreadsheet tracking Richard's expenses by month, by category, and by claimed business purpose. I noted every instance where the expense did not match a client interaction in the CRM. I calculated the total amount he had claimed over 3 years, $231,000. Then I compared that to the expense totals for the other VPs over the same period. The next highest was $101,000. Richard was spending more than double what his peers spent, and there was no corresponding difference in revenue generation that would justify it. His territory was performing in line with the others, sometimes slightly below. If anything, his high expenses should have been paired with exceptional results. They were not. I saved the analysis in an encrypted file and kept digging. The deeper I looked, the more I found. I pulled the quarterly budget reports that were distributed to department heads and noticed that the sales department's travel and entertainment budget had been increased 3 times over the past 2 years, always with vague justifications about expanding client engagement or increasing market presence. I pulled the board meeting minutes publicly available to employees through the company intranet and found that the CFO had raised concerns about rising sales expenses in 2 separate meetings, but those concerns had been dismissed by the CEO, who had said the investments were necessary for growth. I pulled the commission data and noticed something else. Richard had restructured the commission plan 18 months earlier in a way that shifted more revenue credit to management and less to individual account managers. The change had been presented as a way to reward team collaboration, but the practical effect was that Richard's own compensation had increased by approximately $85,000 per year while the account manager's commissions had stayed flat or decreased. I documented all of it. Then I started talking to people. I reached out to 3 former account managers who had left the company in the past 2 years, people I had stayed in touch with and who I knew had been targeted by Richard. I asked them about their experiences, and I asked whether they had ever raised concerns about his behavior or his expenses. 2 of them said they had submitted complaints to HR about the public humiliation and the hostile work environment, and both complaints had been dismissed with the explanation that Richard's management style was direct but not discriminatory. One of them said she had noticed irregularities in his expense reports and had mentioned it to the finance department, but she had been told that expense audits were confidential and that she should focus on her own responsibilities. I asked if she would be willing to provide a written statement about what she had observed. She said yes, as long as it was anonymous. I told her it would be. I collected statements from all 3 former employees detailing the pattern of public humiliation, the gender and racial disparities in who got targeted, and the concerns about expense irregularities. Then I compiled everything: the expense analysis, the budget reports, the commission restructuring data, the employee statements, and a timeline showing how Richard's behavior had escalated over time into a single document. It was 79 pages. I titled it Sales Leadership Conduct and Financial Irregularities, a Pattern Analysis. And I sent it to 3 people: the CFO, the General Counsel, and the Chair of the Board's Audit Committee. I did not send it anonymously. I put my name on it. I included my contact information and a cover letter stating that I was bringing forward concerns about financial impropriety and workplace misconduct that I believed warranted formal investigation. I acknowledged that some of the information was based on analysis and inference rather than direct access to source documents, and I requested that the company conduct a full audit of the sales department's expenses and management practices. I sent the email on a Thursday evening, and I got a response from the General Counsel on Friday morning asking me to meet with her and the CFO the following Monday. That weekend, I prepared for the possibility that I would be fired. I backed up all my files. I reviewed my employment contract to understand my severance terms and non-compete clauses. I consulted with an employment attorney about wrongful termination and whistleblower protections, and I practiced staying calm. The meeting happened on Monday at 10:00 a.m. in the General Counsel's office. The CFO was there, along with the head of internal audit, a man I had never met before. They asked me to walk them through the document. I did. I explained how I had compiled the data, what patterns I had identified, and why I believed those patterns warranted investigation. They asked whether I had shared the document with anyone else. I said I had not, other than sending it to the 3 recipients. They asked whether I had discussed my concerns with Richard or with HR before escalating. I said I had not felt safe doing so given Richard's pattern of retaliation and given that previous complaints to HR had been dismissed. The CFO asked whether I understood the seriousness of what I was alleging. I said I did, and that I would not have brought it forward if I did not believe the evidence supported it. The General Counsel thanked me, said they would review the information, and asked me not to discuss the matter with anyone else while they conducted their review. I agreed. Then I went back to my desk and waited. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, I continued doing my job, managing my accounts, and avoiding any interaction with Richard beyond what was absolutely necessary. He did not mention the receipt incident again. He did not call me out in any meetings. In fact, he seemed to be avoiding me, which suggested that someone had told him an investigation was underway. I later learned that the company had brought in an external forensic accounting firm to audit the sales department's expenses, and that the firm had requested 5 years of records, not just the 3 years I had analyzed. They reviewed every expense report Richard had submitted. They interviewed employees, former employees, and vendors. They examined the commission restructuring and the budget increases, and they found more than I had documented. The total amount of inappropriate or fraudulent expenses that Richard had claimed over 5 years was $427,000. Some of it was legitimate business expenses that had been inflated, claiming a $300 dinner as $600, or adding personal charges to a business hotel stay. Some of it was entirely fabricated, submitting receipts for client meetings that never happened, or claiming reimbursement for travel to cities he had never visited. And some of it was outright theft, using the company credit card for personal vacations, family dinners, and luxury purchases that had nothing to do with business. The forensic accountants also found that Richard had pressured the finance department to approve his expenses without the normal review process, claiming that as a VP he should not be subject to the same scrutiny as lower-level employees. And they found that he had retaliated against employees who questioned his spending, including the former account manager who had raised concerns and was subsequently placed on a performance improvement plan and pushed out of the company. The audit report was delivered to the board in late November, and Richard was placed on administrative leave the next day. 2 weeks later, he was terminated for cause. The company issued a press release, vague corporate language about leadership changes and commitment to financial integrity, but did not disclose the details of the investigation. Internally, the CFO sent an email to all employees stating that the company had completed an audit of sales department practices, had identified violations of company policy, and had taken appropriate action. Richard was not mentioned by name, but everyone knew. The company also took steps to address the systemic issues. They implemented a new expense approval process with mandatory secondary reviews for all expenses over $500, regardless of seniority. They restructured the commission plan to eliminate the management revenue credit that had disproportionately benefited Richard. They revised the HR complaint process to include an external hotline for reporting concerns about executive misconduct. And they issued corrective payments to the 3 account managers whose commissions had been reduced by the restructuring, totaling approximately $140,000. I was not one of those 3. My commissions had not been directly impacted, but I was called into a meeting with the CEO 4 months after Richard's termination. He thanked me for bringing the issues forward, acknowledged that the company had failed to act on earlier warning signs, and offered me a promotion to Director of Strategic Accounts with a significant salary increase and expanded responsibilities. He also said the company would be implementing mandatory leadership training on respectful workplace conduct, and he asked if I would be willing to participate in developing the curriculum. I accepted the promotion. I declined the curriculum development role. I had done enough. Richard did not go quietly. He hired a lawyer and filed a wrongful termination lawsuit, claiming that the investigation had been a pretext and that he was being scapegoated for broader financial issues within the company. The company settled the lawsuit 8 months later for an undisclosed amount with a mutual non-disparagement clause. Richard's LinkedIn profile listed him as an independent sales consultant, but I never saw his name associated with any major companies after that. His reputation in the industry was finished. As for me, I stayed at Stratton Industries for 2 more years. I built out the Strategic Accounts division, hired a team of talented account managers, and created a culture where performance was rewarded and public humiliation was not tolerated. And I never forgot the feeling of sitting in that cafeteria while Richard held up my receipt and used it to humiliate me in front of 230 people. He did it because he believed I was powerless, because he assumed that fear of retaliation would keep me silent, and because he had operated without accountability for so long that he thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. I had access to data, I had analytical skills, I had integrity. And I had the courage to escalate, even when escalation meant risking my career. He publicly humiliated me over a receipt. The audit exposed $427,000 in fraud and a multi-million-dollar pattern of misconduct that destroyed his career and reformed an entire organization. And the distance between those 2 moments was filled with spreadsheets, encrypted files, and the quiet, methodical work of building a case so thorough that no one could ignore it.